which they had no way of maintaining. So as a way of doing this, what they call disestablished the Irish Church. They suppressed a lot of bishoprics, and that meant that a number of churches, particularly, became, if you like, property of the state. They stopped being church property, and they became state property. And they were the first national monuments to be created. It was churches that were vacated at this time in history. It also resulted in a very strange anomaly in Irish law, which is that churches that are still in use for worship cannot be national monuments. So you could have a medieval cathedral, but it can't be a monument. It can be protected, however, by other laws, but not by national monuments law. So, with that little piece of history, with the arrival of the national monument sector, the state, of course, then gradually took on responsibility, not immediately, but over a period of time. And I suppose as part of that, they divided the country up into regions. They established different centres where there were craftspeople based, with architects overseeing the work, and with what you call in-house training and education, so that if the craftspeople were trained, the architects generally not, because in that stage architectural training was still very much in a Beaux-Arts mode, and it had a lot of, if you like, the knowledge of traditional constructions and so on was built in there as well. So in more recent times, as far as the professions were concerned, the state was used to seconding. In other words, giving people time off to do postgraduate study in order to bring their skills and the knowledge up to where it should be. There was also a state training agency which set out to train craftspeople to work on monuments and protected buildings. The non-government sector is really made up of civic trusts, amenity societies, and so on. And in a way, probably the major impetus behind the changes in legislation in the 19th century came initially from the involvement of antiquarian societies in the restoration of medieval monuments. And it was partly to control the activities of those people that the controlling legislation was brought in. However, the NGO sector, I call it, continues to be very heavily involved. And they provide really high quality training courses, the Irish Georgian Society and the Dublin Civic Trust, mostly by importing specialists from overseas. So they run short courses which professionals take to bring their skills, let's say, to advance their skills. So they're, going back to the previous diagram I showed, there are three sectors and they actually do interconnect quite a bit. Professional bodies, there are three that are worth talking about very briefly. There's the Royal Institute of the Architects of Ireland, the Engineers Ireland, and the Institute of Chartered Surveyors. I'll touch a little bit on those, but particularly on the Royal Institute of the Architects of Ireland. Because, and again, I'm going to take a little step backwards to be able to talk about this particular slide. I suppose from the 1960s onwards, there was quite a shift in the way historic buildings were looked at in Ireland. Really from, if you can imagine that after colonial wars, say, finishing in 1921, the buildings that were inherited from the ruling classes were not really well regarded. It's a familiar story, as we can see now, from post-colonial societies everywhere, but it was the same thing in Ireland. The great national monuments, the medieval cathedrals that were in ruins, the old monasteries, the megalithic tombs, all of those sorts of things were cared for by the state. The other buildings, the great houses, the George and Dublin, all of these places, were sometimes protected by planning law, and quite often not. A lot of them were destroyed, and there was no great impetus for extending the level of protection that was there. Things changed a little bit towards the middle to the end of the 20th century. There were some major events. There was the destruction by Dublin Corporation of probably the largest Viking site in Europe to build their civic offices, which brought out hundreds of thousands of people in protest. So as a direct result of a change of consciousness, and also the fact that you got things like the Convention for Protection of the Architectural Heritage in Europe, the Granada Convention, you got a movement to introduce new legislation to protect historic buildings. So in 1995, there was a document produced called Towards Strengthening the Protection of the Architectural Heritage, which set out a roadmap for how this would be done. The result was the planning legislation that I referred to earlier in the year 2000. I'm going to talk a little bit how that affects things, but we go on now. Back to the profession. In the middle of all of this discussion, the architectural profession found itself at a serious disadvantage because it was associated with developers who were tearing down historic buildings and not with the attempts to preserve them, which is where the non-government sector was involved. So if you like, the architectural profession was seen on the side of the bad guys. It took that position quite seriously, and as a result, over a period of time, it started to see how it could improve. And as a result of all of that, it introduced an accreditation system for conservation within the profession of architecture. And I was very much involved in that whole business, and I have some responsibility for its defects as well. It's a 3-level system. Grade 1 is the lowest level, and it's the level at which it is assumed that all professional architects should have. In other words, they should have an awareness of historic buildings and their importance, how to assess them, and how to look for help, and so on and so forth. It should basically be normal professional competence, is what is required there. Grade 2 is a level above that, things that architects can work on buildings protected through the planning acts. And grade 3 certifies architects to work on all protected buildings, whether through one set of acts or the other. The way you actually get accreditation is quite interesting too, because all of this is post membership of a professional body. So that, say, grade 1, you get access to that by doing a program of lectures and sitting an examination. This is after your professional qualification. Grade 2 and grade 3 are got by submitting portfolios of work done, some under supervision, some under your own thing, and being judged on the basis not just of the work, but of your own evaluation of the work. So these are the way that the grades are decided. There are many folds, but I'll come back to it at the end of the lecture. There is one anomaly, which is that the Royal Institute is both the registration body for the profession in Ireland, and there's also a representative body of the profession in Ireland. And those two positions are not always reconcilable. Okay, now just the second part. That was just by way of background. Historic building conservation academic programs in Ireland, there are really only 2 that are worth talking about. One is the one that I've been involved in, which of course is by far the best, but still. And the other is in our companion university in Dublin, which is Trinity College Dublin. The first one is this Master of Urban and Building Conservation, which was set up in 1987. I took it over in 1989. And if you just remember briefly, this is actually before the new legislation was in place. When I started working on it, the program wasn't working very well. And I thought that it really needed to be rethought. So very, if you like, coldly, I decided to do a couple of things. One is that it was going to be a program that I would open to people who already had a good bit of experience as professional architects, who had already actually built, supervised, had taken responsibility for the administration of contracts and so on. We would aim it for those in the first instance. And second, that we would do it in, if you like, a two-tier way. We would do it as a research degree, but a research degree that you got access through an intensive program. So it was a contradictory animal as far as the academy was concerned, because you were supposed to have either taught programs or research programs. So we produced this hybrid, which was an intense teaching program first, and then you got access to do your research degree afterwards. And the other thing that as part of that is that I made a decision that any of the teaching programs that we introduced would lean very heavily on analytical skills, on understanding the nature of the problems. And it would also, that applied both to the theoretical problems and to the technical problems. So that from a technical point of view, for example, we would have placed great emphasis on understanding decay processes. In other words, what actually happened to materials as they grow older, and then how you might intervene in relation to those. So very strictly, I suppose quite narrow focus in some respects as far as the teaching program is concerned, but very concerned with actually how to develop an understanding of the nature of the problem. And the thesis then, which was an academic piece of work, a research thing, that all the normal academic standards applied in that respect. The Trinity program arrived sometime later, and it's called Applied Building Repair and Conservation. It's a one-year postgraduate diploma, and it's directed in the main towards engineers and surveyors. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So first of all, my own School of Architecture, and the way architectural education works for us is that there is a 5-year program, which is divided in two with the Bologna, the bachelor's and the master's, but it's a 5-year unitary program. At the end of that, you are not entitled to access to the profession. You are required, in addition to that 5 years of study, to do at least 2 years of supervised practice work in a practice, and to pass another further examination, which is a diploma in professional practice or practical experience. What that means is that any of the architects who come into conservation programs have been through that process. Plus, they've had additional time after that as well. So they're quite mature professionals by the time they come in. We'll just tell you that's what it is. Now, within the 5 years primary architecture programs, there are no courses in conservation. None at all. When I was there in the school and was head of the school, we ran a subject which we called the ecology of architecture. And the ecology of architecture, of course, dealt with the change in buildings over their lifetime. It was one of, and still is, one of my major criticisms that architectural history, and Patrick, what we've just heard, doesn't actually deal with transformations. Mostly it deals with, what happened when. But the transformation of buildings is fundamental to the understanding that you need to have when you come as an understanding of history. That's what it means when you're trying to intervene in the life of a building, because that's what we do. So now, because things have changed a little bit, the Ecology of Architecture program no longer exists, and we use that to focus in the main on the questions of building reuse and what sorts of issues those raised. And those sorts of issues now are translated into the History of Architecture program. So it's moved from being a special subject called Ecology of Architecture now into History of Architecture program. So the postgraduate programs in conservation are the Master of Urban and Building Conservation that I referred to earlier, which is MUBC was the title of it, and the PhD program. And then there is a hybrid, which I'll talk to you a little bit later again, about the Master of Science, Master of Architectural Science, Conservation and Heritage. And that has arisen directly as a response of developments within academia. The Master of Urban and Building Conservation, it's a 2-year program. The program structures, there are 5 core modules, which is the teaching program. One elective model, which has to be taken outside the School of Architecture in some related discipline. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And the content of the core program aligns with the ICAMUS guidelines for education and training in the conservation of monuments, ensembles and sites, published in 1993. If you're, I'll show a slide on that in a moment. The thesis module was a way, again, of us trying to bring things together. It's a major, it takes over a year and a half really is covered by it, and it ends up in a thesis dissertation. The ICAMUS guidelines on education and training, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but sometimes it's worthwhile just having a look at what's listed. They were drafted by Bernard Fielden. He was at that stage working in ICRUM in Rome. He was the director there for a number of years. While he was there, he started drafting these things. They are fairly unexceptional in a way, but sometimes it's no harm to kind of look down and see what it says. Again, they have guided the taught program. And in a way, if you look at them carefully, you can see the number of times it says understand, find and absorb, understand, diagnose, etc., etc. It's completely consistent with what I said in the beginning. My first intention was to develop the skills in understanding, no matter what particular area that we were working in. So the core taught program, the teaching staff are drawn from the architecture school, from other university disciplines, lots of private sector professionals, craftspeople, public sector professionals, and heritage bodies as well. The teaching modes are, again, not extraordinary. Lectures, you think seminars. Very strong emphasis on site visits conducted by the conservators involved. Practicals, which are, again, to do with workshop type activities, so the students actually get hands-on experience of certain materials, and a number of projects. And the lectures are in different groups, and I'm not going to go down through the painful schedule of all the lectures that we give you, but those are the groupings of them. Conservation history, theory and policy, research methods, conservation case studies and reflective practice. Materials and technology is done twice. So again, very simply, those are within those you can multiply their 20 or 30 or whatever lectures and seminars and site visits and all sorts of things between them. But it gives you a flavour of what the taught part of the programme actually covers. And that's really all I want to do for today. The thesis programme has 2 major projects built into it. And it is a way of trying to make sure that when somebody starts to develop a serious piece of academic work, that they have had an opportunity to apply some of the things they're supposedly learning almost as a dry run before actually getting into the thesis itself. And this are just a couple of pictures from one of those projects. This particular is an urban study, which is generally done as a group study. They're usually, we pick a particular town or a part of a town and go through a whole business of analysis through urban historical, urban morphology, all of those sorts of things are done. So the analytical skills, the recording skills, we train people in the use of how to carry out architecture inventories. So they're specific practical things that people are taught on the way through. This one was carried out in the context of a research project. It's a bit unusual. A project that I got some time ago, which is called Framework for the Appraisal of Cultural Significance. It's a very kind of weighty title in a way, but it's when I refer back to the fact that Ireland is really only coming to grips with a very large section of its historical inheritance. To be able to find a way where you can approach the question of assessing cultural significance is quite important. And it was commissioned by the state for us to do that, so that was part of that. The actual building study itself is more conventional sort of thing. It's something that every program does, where an individual student gets a building, analyzes it in detail, produces the drawings and the surveys, maps the decay mechanisms that are visible on the facade, all of those sorts of things, does a structural study of it and all of those sort of things. And it comes down at the end to a proposition for intervention. What we're not asking people in this study is to develop a detailed design for intervention. We're asking to make a proposition and to do enough graphically and whatever it is to explain exactly what they intend to do. But the emphasis in this is really on the first four. So the thesis, again, I'm just going to go quite quickly through this now. It's intended as a serious piece of research. Quite a lot of them have ended up being published in their own right, although they are actually master's theses. But they are kind of, they're fairly well regarded, since the number of times they've been cited in serious academic publications since then is quite heartening for me anyway. But the key issue is developing continuity, because we're not exactly flavour of the month in terms of people throwing money at us, and actually being able to sustain a line of inquiry that will support, for example, doctoral level thesis over a period of time. It's not always easy to do that. Okay, just a brief word in passing. This research project that I mentioned, the Framework for the Appraisal of Cultural Significance, is funded by the Office of Public Works. They're the people who have all the monuments in their care. And it's produced with a lot of research at master's and doctoral level, postdoctoral fellowship, international conference and publication, but it is the exception, it's not the rule. And it's now come to an end. We're just finalising the final report, so after that it's back to poverty again, I think. Now, just a brief word on Trinity, because the Trinity programme, the Applied Building Repair and Conservation, because it's part of the landscape. And I interpreted the invitation to speak today as trying to give an indication of what the landscape in conservation education is, rather than go into the detail, find the fine detail of what's actually there. This is a program which was kind of roughly modelled on what I had established for the MEBC, except turned into conducted with a different orientation and as a part-time diploma. And it's aimed, say, mainly at engineers and surveyors, although architects do it as well. And it's run by somebody who's a Spanish woman who is a material scientist herself. She has access to laboratories, so it has that kind of orientation to it. And it's one that's recognised and approved by Engineers Ireland, and it's recognised by the conservation accreditation system as well, as of course is the MEBC. Okay, there's just some details about it. I don't really need to go down through various things. They're just there to fill space on the screen, so I can move on quickly. Okay, I want to look across the water to the UK very briefly, because there are some similarities and there are some differences. The first case, the UK is a lot bigger than us, and it's had kind of a system of conservation looking after buildings, starting more or less around the right same time sort of middle of the 19th century with William Morris and his acolytes. So, and I say, we kept very much in parallel right up probably until the 1920s. All of I should say that I've had very limited teaching experience in the UK. I've lectured in the AA, but not elsewhere. But I've acted as an external examiner on a number of courses in the UK, in England and in Scotland. Not in Wales, so I don't know about that side of things. But all of the programs that I have been involved in are, again, they're post-first degree. That doesn't mean they're post-professional qualification. They're post-bachelor's degree. They have a high standard of initial entry, but their intake is from a range of disciplines. History of art, geography, planning, all of those sorts of things, as well as you do get graduate architects as well, but they're not, the way they're geared is like this. It usually takes 1 year full-time as a taught program, and that leads ultimately to a postgraduate diploma. Depending on performance in the diploma, people can go on to do a master's degree with what we would regard as a minor dissertation. Now, the courses that I've been involved in, particularly an examiner in Bath in England at the moment, the standard there is very high. So the standard of the dissertation work is pretty good. And their intensive programs are very intense. And they do it very well. There's also, in addition to those, there's a craft-based program, a number of programs, sorry, of I hit the wrong one. Yeah, the Weald Downland Lifelong Learning Program. The Weald Downland is a museum, but along with the museum, it develops a whole range of skills, conservation, repair skills, in a number of traditional building modes, brickwork, timber, things like that. And they have very high level, intensive, short courses, which they do as well. And they're part of this thing as well. And then there are some part-time programs as well. The thing about the mainstream academic programs is that they have what they call a Conservation Course Directors Forum, which I used to be a member of. And it's a group that meets several times a year. There are 13 university-based programs that are members of it, as well as the Weald Downland Museum. And they discuss policy and programs and things like that, say at a regular interval. You also have a very proactive engagement by English Heritage and Historic Scotland. They have been, certainly Historic Scotland has been a model and has been a huge help to us as well. We have modelled a lot of our training programs on their intensive programs that they do. And in both cases, they have had quite an active part in shaping how the postgraduate programs are designed. There's a continuous dialogue between, for example, English Heritage in South Scotland and the Conservation Course Directors Forum. So there's quite a lot of the other thing is there's a huge range of amenity and heritage societies and trusts. And in England, and in particular, is a nightmare to try to figure out, who are the bodies that are exercising influence at a particular time. This is on top of the planning and control system and all of that, these societies. Every cathedral has its own conservation group, usually with very highly professional, highly organized, and very well-informed people. So there's a kind of what you'd call it, there's a customer base, to put it very crudely, which is quite sophisticated and very active, so there are also a wide range of conservation accreditation bodies. So when I say it's a nightmare, here's just a few of them. The Architects Accredited in Building Conservation, it's an independent body, which was set up a number of years ago because the Royal Institute of British Architects were afraid to do it. This group of people set themselves up to do it and have been running ever since. The Royal Institute of the Royal Incorporation of Architects of Scotland, they have an accreditation system with 2 levels in it. We have 3, but they have 2, and they're probably just as good. 2 and 3 are 3. Royal Institute of British Architects, they finally got their act together, and they now have an accreditation system that has 3 levels in it. Specialist is really, would be the, I suppose, the equivalent of our grade 3, although it's slightly different. Conservation architect, we're somewhere between our grade 2 and grade 1. Concentrated registrant is somebody who simply puts their name in and says, look, I want to be part of this club, and that sort of thing. The Royal Incorporation of Institute of Chartered Surveyors, it recognises programmes in the UK and in Ireland. And then these other ones, the Chartered Institute of Building and so on. So the business of knowing which courses are top of the range is not a completely straightforward business. There are people who will have accreditation by one or another or by several of these bodies overlapping, etc. It's a major industry. Okay. Now, come back to UCD basically and the impact of the MUBC and the primary focus for my presentation, really, education versus training. And the impact that the MUBC program has had over almost 30 years now. We have contributed to producing a cohort of key professionals and administrators that have had an education in conservation, philosophy, practice, exposure to conservation sites in Ireland and overseas, and so on. That's kind of been, I feel like, was part of the design in the beginning, to target that kind of position. And those people are employed throughout the state and the local authority sector, as well as in practice. There's a new profession of conservation officers has been created who work in local authorities. The senior officers at state level and local authority, they've also been involved in the academic context continuously over time, and have been used to having their work reviewed and their lectures reviewed and so on and so forth. So it's created, if you like, a climate of discussion there as well. It's been a major adjustment to the architecture profession, and I think we've made some contribution to intellectual life as well. However, now there are some challenges and some difficulties, which today is really where I wanted to go after this very long sort of preliminary journey. There's a challenge to expertise. There's the question of access to specialist programs. There's the emergence of a wider range of heritage professionals. There's a lack of clarity in the system as a whole. And there are flaws in the accreditation system. I'll come back to talk about all of these things and the answers to them. There are pressures from within the academy, and most people, certainly most teachers and researchers, will be familiar with these. The focus of architecture education is a serious question, an ongoing question. There's a university agenda, which is a development of a more specific research focus that's fairly narrowly understood. And there's also a government agenda, which is common to most European countries. Certainly in our case, hugely increasing the numbers of people, but also reducing the money paid to universities. So it's a massive pressure on academic staff. So in terms of the challenge to expertise, just to spell that out a little bit, the access to specialist programs, they are an additional time and money cost to professionals who have just been going through a major recession, just hit the building industry more strongly than most. So it's been a serious challenge for all programs, really, for the 2 programs in Ireland. There are also a limited number of providers, and they're both based in Dublin, which is the capital, but there's more to Ireland than the capital. So I said there's an issue there. reduction in participation by the state and other public bodies. As their own budgets have shrunk, their staff have shrunk, the remaining staff are under massive pressure to do the same amount of work or more. And what they do for us is on top of that again, is additional to that. So it makes it more difficult to bring same breadth of expertise and experience into the teaching programs. It's still being done, but it's more difficult to do it. There's a wider range of heritage professionals. That's actually sometimes not a total blessing, you know, because there are, I suppose, legislation is there to be interpreted and to be given effect to. And it's very often people who are in administrative positions don't actually have the practical experience of actually translating legislation into action. So it's, if you like, it's multiplied in one way, the levels that need to be gone through. That in turn means it's also reflected in the lack of clarity, because people are often not actually clear about what different people can do and what they should be doing. For example, the business of what conservation officers should know or should not know, the limitations of their I suppose their powers and so on. And it's my experience has been that when one can deal with those people directly and openly and quickly from the beginning of a project, there's not a problem. If people don't do that and give time for people to work on their own agendas, it becomes much more complex. The accreditation system that we've established in the Institute of Architects is not working properly, in my view. There is no effective progression through the system. There are 3 grades. Grade 3 is the top grade. But the number of people who've made their way from either grade 1 to grade 2 or from grade 2 to grade 3 is minimal. Now, why is that? There's not an awful lot of work. There's also not an awful lot of people who are in a position at one level to take on the kind of work that they would need to do to get them to the next. Normally you would have to do that under supervision of somebody else. But if there's not an awful lot of work to do it, it's hard to do it. So there are built-in flaws in the accreditation system. There's also human nature being what it is, a tendency for misrepresentation of people who is an architect accredited at grade 1. It's quite possible that they would put down somewhere at the bottom of their headed paper, architect accredited in conservation, full stop. Doesn't say anything about grade 1. And also the general public might think that grade 1 is more important than grade 3. So, you know, it's actually, it's a very far from perfect system. The pressure from the academy is, I say you're familiar with it. I mean, the focus of architecture education, the primary focus, in my own school, it has always been a design-led school. In the time when I was head of school as well, it was still a design-led school. And of course, the primacy then is called the cultural practice, the business of design. And as conservationists, we still have not grasped that nettle. We're as much to blame as anybody else, in my view. But it's an ongoing task for us, and it's a serious one. There's the university agenda we know about. I won't belabor that point. It's clear enough. The focus on sciences, postgraduate taught programs are seen as the taught programs kind of are seen as an underpinning. I referred earlier to the MArch science in conservation and heritage. What that is a way to hoover in, to draw in from other areas of the university, people who will attend part of the taught elements that go into the conservation program proper. And that makes it economic. You know, if we didn't get a full lecture room and people looking at, attending certain modules, we would not be able to run the conservation program. You know, that's the kind of thing that people are being forced to do, and they do it as best they can. the government funding thing I've mentioned. So some of the response to the challenges, the access to specialist programs, there are some part-time options. You can do MEBC part-time, and the Trinity one is part-time as well. There are also a lot of initiatives from the NGO sector, which are very good, but they don't actually lead to accreditation as such. There are a wider range of heritage practitioners. Okay, there is actually accreditation is helping in that situation, because surveyors and engineers, the surveyors have an accreditation system, the engineers don't as yet, but they're working towards it. So the wider range of heritage practitioners will be covered by different accreditation systems in the future. The lack of clarity, okay, that's a motherhood and apple pie kind of thing. There's general public education, which is people are working on all the time anyway, and there are some activities under the government policy for architecture, which is a lot of educational activities under that, which are helping in that instance as well. The procurement question is almost impossible to, I don't know how it affects you here in Italy, but certainly the way it affects us in Ireland is that more and more people in public authorities and their commission work are looking to reduce risk. And what that means is that they introduce what they call pre-qualification benchmarks. So for example, if they have a relatively minor piece of work that's been advertised for public tender, you might have to have insurance policies that would cover you up to about 3 to 10 million. You know, your chances, your income for all of your life wouldn't come to anywhere near that sort of thing. So it means that in the beginning, a lot of people would find themselves cut out from that business, and the only way they can do it is by associating into groups and so on with other people. So it's a major kind of inhibition, and there's no sign that it's improving really. The flaws in the accreditation system, let's say it's only architects and surveyors at the moment. The institute, I think, the Institute of Architects is very slow to take action. And I can understand why, because it's a small country, and sometimes it's very difficult to pursue people who are known to be cutting corners and doing things, but it has to be done. Because I think once the credibility of a system, an accreditation system, is undermined, you won't be able to rebuild it again. So it has to be done. Pressure from the Academy, again, I won't go into it in huge detail, but you can see I mentioned there the grafting of specific talk programs onto the MEBC structure. In one way, the sharing of modules can actually be quite a good thing. I refer to it as a kind of a device first, but it actually can have some real benefits, because it's very useful to have graduates from different disciplines. Certainly in certain areas, when you start talking about, for example, conservation in urban areas, to have planners, urban designers and so on around the table, it becomes quite useful in a way to change the intellectual climate as well. Changes in the government agenda is weeping and gnashing of teeth, basically, is the only response that I've seen to the difficulties that emerged there. Okay, so just finishing now. Really, in terms of looking at a landscape of conservation education in Ireland, there's been really 2 decades of massive change. It's 2014 now, the major legislation started to change in 1995, 2000, 2001 and so on. So the new legislation is very new. And the changing responsibilities and the increase in the institutional and professional complexities, they still have to work their way through, it seems to me. There is an issue, generally speaking, which is the level of intake into conservation programs. Conservation programs I always had an upper limit of 12 into the MEBC. I wouldn't go any higher than that. the Trinity program has an upper limit of 17. It won't go any higher than that. In both cases, it was because we were limited because of lab space, because of the access to tutorials, because of the kind of intensity of the program. We couldn't widen it beyond that. To actually get those numbers in the last few years has been difficult. So there have been times when there were 4 people doing the NUBC in a year. The Trinity program I spoke to Sarah Pavia there before I came here, they went down to 6, you know. So there's no guarantees going in this business, you know. If a university decides that it wants to have that kind of cultural engagement that these programs actually represent, then fine. And if the School of Architecture or the School of Engineering in Trinity decide that it's worth their while, then fine. But if the climate changes or the people change, then there's no guarantee, and there's not sufficient kind of clientele to make sure that these things are very solidly based. Again, I think your programs in Italy will probably be very different in terms of the numbers involved in it, but I suspect the underlying dynamics are not so very, very different. But I think what we would see is that our funding for these education programs will probably increasingly depend on what kind of alliances we can form. First of all, within agencies that are engaged in conservation in the country. We need to have that continuous dialogue anyway between theory and practice, which can only be done with face-to-face contact and usually on site. It's impossible to reproduce without being confronted with the artifact. And the second thing is in interinstitutional collaboration. And that's something that is ongoing. It's one that, certainly at national level, we're doing it. I suspect for our longer-term survival, international collaboration, certainly in the area of funding, is completely unavoidable. I can't see how we can go beyond without it. So, yeah, question for the Academy, I put a question mark in, and I finished there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Philip, for a very wide framework and look to a very complex world. Even if it's a very little country with only 4.5 million of inhabitants, it has so many specificities and differences, it is quite astonishing. But it's one of the results of a long history of tutorship based on the private tutorship, not by the state engagement. And it's also the result of a history of separation between conservation and architecture, that it doesn't belong to our culture. We have now the opposite problem, and we are now at risk of disappearing. So, not now, because we are so late, but in the future. So, thank you once again, Professor Philip. Adesso in italiano, devo dire che per 3 anni, adesso si è messo, lo ricordate, per 3 anni sono stato sia lui external examiner all'UCD di Dublino, che per me è stata un'esperienza molto formativa perché ho dovuto leggere e capire, il mio inglese non è e non era, almeno nel passato, così buono, dei tomi di questa dimensione, delle loro tesi completamente diverse dalle nostre. Quindi è stato un esercizio importante per capire poi anche certe incomprensioni a livello internazionale dell'uso dei termini e delle prospettive. Poi, come ha detto il professor Chili, c'è qualcosa che ci unisce, l'attenzione all'analisi, allo studio, alla comprensione, però spesso ci dividiamo proprio per incomprensioni lessicali, terminologiche anche. Bene, passiamo al prossimo relatore, prossima relatrice, e invito qui la professoressa Donata Danuta Losek-Kozlowska, che viene dalla Università di Tecnologia di Varsavia, e quindi ci parlerà dell'insegnamento, del restauro nell'ambito polacco e ci farà una breve storia anche lei di come si è arrivati alla situazione attuale, partendo da due contributi distinti, uno prevalentemente legato agli studi urbani, quindi la conservazione vista come una risorsa, una necessità all'interno degli studi urbani, e l'altra nata invece nell'ambito della storia dell'architettura polacca. Quindi lasciamo la parola alla professoressa Danuta, che ci darà anche il list dell'Europa. Grazie mille.
Grazie mille, è un gran piacere di essere qui, di essere con un cerchio di specialisti così simpatici. Sembra che tutti approfittiamo di questo contatto. Thank you very much. I will read my text to be shortly because the time is very limited and I think that I have only 6 pages, so don't worry. only 30 minutes. So the subject is the beginnings towards protection, urban heritage, the beginnings of monument conservation and heritage protection in the Warsaw School of Architecture. The presentation will be focused on the study of the protection of urban heritage in the Faculty of Architecture of Warsaw University of Technology, showing the progress of conservation ideas and its academic background developed since the Faculty of Architecture was opened in 1915. As you see, in 2015 we will celebrate the centenary of our faculty. It was also just before Poland regained independence in 1918. First of all, I must be stressed that from the very beginning, monument protection in Warsaw University was connected with urban planning and the scale of the city, gaining invaluable support for 2 teams led by 2 illustrious professors, Oskar Sosnowski's Department of Polish Architecture and Tadeusz Dołbiński's Chair of Town Building. Those 2 teams represented 2 parallel lines of research on urban heritage protection, which defined the Warsaw School of Architecture. One which was connected with the methodology and practice of modern town planning, made issues of urban heritage vital from the start. The other, connected with the theory of monument conservation and protection of historic towns, focused on the history of Polish architecture, including the history of towns and applying urban planning scale analysis in those studies. Together, those 2 lines of research, inspired by 2 outstanding individuals, initiated Polish studies on the methodology of town planning and provided foundations for the history of urban building, and new discipline developed within the Warsaw School of Architecture after the Second World War by Professor Wacław Ostrowski and Professor Teresa Zaremska, my professor and master. Tadeusz Dołbiński's School of Urban Planning was unique due to his awareness of the impact of history and environment on town development. Dołbiński was a graduate of the Polytechnic in Karlsruhe, where he got acquainted with the famous German idea of the historical analysis of towns, formulated by the eminent art historian Albrecht Erich Brinkmann in his 4-volume study Stadtbaukunst from 1920, the first academic synthesis on the history of town building. Years later, having experience of town planning practice, Taubiński distanced himself from the German school and proposed his own significantly different criteria of analyzing the historical space of towns. He described them in the study, Town Planning, whose first volume, entitled Town Building in the Past, was published in 1932. This novel criteria he called town planning factors. Among them, he listed today quite obvious natural conditions, economic and social conditions, differences, consideration, defense consideration, transport consideration, law and customs. But he focused particularly on factor 6, urban composition, which he described as a factor of consciousness, creativity. In this criterion, he inscribed the issue of beauty in urban space and town landscape. He wrote, "The artistic aspect of the town and the landscape is nowadays not less significant than the social, economic, and technical aspects." He argued also that studying the towns requires individual perspectives and sensitivity, which determine the diverse research approaches. He also noticed new analytic instruments for the modern historian of town planning and suggested a graphic form of historical analysis stressing the practical aspect of messages that should be easily decoded by urban planners. Taubiński applied his postulates in practice while working on the development plan for Warsaw in 1916. His creative idea of development of Warsaw was encoded in the chart entitled The Historical Outline. This is important, the historical outline of the stages of the city's development in connection with the present condition and the intended expansion, development. This drawing was a creative projection of the historical analysis of Warsaw onto the modern vision of the city's development. The importance of historical analysis of urban planning was also appreciated by Professor Oskar Sosnowski, the founder of the Department of Polish Architecture at the Warsaw Faculty of Architecture. Sosnowski was an outstanding personage, his paintings emitting mysterious light, as well as his architectural fantasies, fitted into the international context of the modern epoch. He was modernist, real modernist architect, of course, while he was also very deeply rooted in tradition, sharing the view that beauty had an education mission. As an architect, graphic designer, and painter, he combined many specialties and passions. He was deeply involved and interested in landscape and natural environment, since his father was a very known Polish geographer and scientist. He proved those interests to be immensely important in the methodologically precursory study of Warsaw, entitled in translation, The Emergence, Layout and Characteristic of the Street Network of Great Warsaw. It was prepared in 1925. This is one of the most outstanding and novel Polish studies on history of urban planning, whose assumptions are still relevant and applied by urban planners. This work, published in 1930, became unexpectedly famous after the Second World War, when Jan Zachwatowicz, Sosnowski's student, assistant, and then successor at the Faculty of Architecture, who, having been appointed the General Conservator of Historical Monument in Poland, designed Sosnowski's study as a model for historical studies needed for reconstructing Polish towns after the war damage. It is worth mentioning that in the 60s, in view to the approaching war, students of the Faculty of Architecture made inventories of historical buildings, producing excellent documentation, which after the Second World War made it possible to rebuild the palaces of Krakowskie Przedmieście and Miodowa Street, the houses at Nowy Świat Street, and to reconstruct the whole old town, which was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1980. Jan Zachwatowicz contributed a lot to the project of reconstructing the old town. As a medievalist and the General Conservator of Historical Monuments, he proposed to uncover the medieval town walls and provide the cathedral with a modernist elevation instead of reconstructing the 19th century version, which was considered warless in the post-war years. By the way, it had been designed by the outstanding architect Adam Czkowski. You can see also this in gray. It is what it was before the war. Later, you see inventory of the ruins and also the project of rebuilding. If you would like to now, please to use this